James Kensington was a self-made millionaire. Despite his wealth, he never forgot the people who helped him during his childhood, especially Mrs. Eleanor Carter, his former nanny. She had been like a second mother to him, caring for him when his own parents were too busy with their high society lifestyle. One evening, James invited his family to a lavish dinner at his mansion. Among the guests was Mrs. Carter, now an elderly woman with a frail frame, but the same warm smile. James had insisted on having her there as an honored guest. However, his wife Victoria was less than pleased. Victoria had always been concerned with appearances. She prided herself on hosting elegant parties with only the most influential guests. When she saw Mrs. Carter, dressed simply, her hands rough from years of work, she frowned. "James, who is this woman?" Victoria asked, her tone dripping with disdain. James placed a gentle hand on Mrs. Carter's shoulder. "This is Mrs. Carter. She practically raised me." Victoria scoffed. "She looks more like a servant. Why would you bring someone like her to a family gathering?" A heavy silence filled the room. James's parents, his siblings, and even the waitstaff froze, shocked by Victoria's words. Mrs. Carter's smile faltered, but she remained quiet, her eyes lowering to the table. James clenched his jaw, anger bubbling within him. He had overlooked Victoria's obsession with wealth before, but this was too much. He stood up, his voice firm. "Victoria, I will not tolerate disrespect towards someone who means so much to me. If you cannot show kindness, then you are not the woman I thought you were." Victoria's face turned red. "James, you're embarrassing me." "No," James said, his voice unwavering. "You embarrass yourself." He turned to Mrs. Carter and smiled. "Would you like to stay here with me, Mrs. Carter? This house will always have a place for you." Tears welled up in Mrs. Carter's eyes. "Oh, James, I couldn't." "You can," James interrupted gently. "You took care of me when I had nothing. Now it's my turn." Victoria stormed out of the room, humiliated. That night, James made a decision. He would not allow wealth to dictate his values. Mrs. Carter moved into the guest house on his estate, and James ensured she spent her remaining years in comfort and happiness. As for Victoria, she soon realized that money could buy luxury, but it could never buy a heart as pure as James's. In the weeks that followed, Victoria tried to salvage her position in James's life. She sent apologetic messages, hosted extravagant dinners, and even donated to charity, all in an effort to prove she had changed. But James wasn't convinced. He had seen her true nature, and no amount of superficial gestures could erase the cruelty she had shown to the woman who had raised him. Mrs. Carter, on the other hand, settled into the guest house on the estate. She was hesitant at first, not wanting to be a burden, but James reassured her time and again. "You are family," he reminded her, "and family deserves love and respect." With Mrs. Carter by his side, James found a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. She would sit with him in the garden, telling stories of his childhood, reminding him of the boy he once was, the boy who had big dreams but an even bigger heart. One day, Victoria arrived unannounced at the mansion. Her designer heels clicked against the marble floor as she marched toward James's study. "We need to talk," she demanded. James put down his pen and looked at her calmly. "Go ahead." "I made a mistake," she admitted. "I shouldn't have spoken to that old woman the way I did. But, James, you have to understand, I was raised differently. We come from different worlds." James leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Respect and kindness aren't about where you come from, Victoria. They're about who you choose to be." Victoria crossed her arms. "Are you really going to throw away our marriage over some nanny?" James's expression hardened. "She's not some nanny. She is the reason I survived my childhood. She is the reason I know what love and loyalty look like. And if you can't see that, then you and I were never meant to last." Victoria's face twisted in frustration. "So that's it? You're choosing her over me?" "I'm choosing the person who has always been there for me," James replied. "The person who never made me feel like I had to earn their love." Realizing there was nothing more to say, Victoria turned on her heel and left. Within a few months, their divorce was finalized. James felt no sadness, only relief. With Victoria gone, James focused on what truly mattered. He expanded his charity work, helping children from struggling backgrounds, just as he had once been. And through it all, Mrs. Carter remained by his side, her heart full of pride for the boy she had raised into a great man. Years later, when Mrs. Carter passed away peacefully in her sleep, James made sure her legacy lived on. He established the Eleanor Carter Foundation, dedicated to supporting caretakers and educators who shaped young lives. Standing before a crowd at the foundation's opening ceremony, James smiled, knowing that Mrs. Carter's love would continue to touch lives, just as it had touched his. As the years passed, James Kensington's life took a new direction. No longer burdened by a marriage built on superficiality, he dedicated himself to his work, his charity, and the values Mrs. Carter had instilled in him. The Eleanor Carter Foundation flourished, providing scholarships to children in need and funding programs for caretakers who dedicated their lives to nurturing the next generation. James personally oversaw many of the foundation's initiatives, ensuring that no child would ever feel alone or abandoned the way he once had. One day, during a fundraising gala for the foundation, James was approached by a woman named Elizabeth Morgan. She was a schoolteacher who had volunteered at one of the foundation's orphanage projects. "Mr. Kensington," she said with a warm smile, "I just wanted to thank you for everything your foundation has done. These children, they're getting a chance at life because of you." James chuckled. "Please call me James. And I assure you, the real heroes are people like you, who dedicate their time and love to these kids." They spoke for hours that evening, discussing their shared passion for helping others. Unlike Victoria, Elizabeth didn't care about wealth or status. She cared about people. There was something comforting about her presence, something that reminded him of Mrs. Carter's kindness. Over the next year, their friendship deepened, and eventually, love found its way into James's heart again. Unlike his first marriage, this relationship was built on mutual respect, shared values, and a genuine connection. When James proposed to Elizabeth, it wasn't with a grand spectacle or an extravagant ring. It was during a visit to one of the orphanages they had helped build together. With the children gathered around them, he knelt and held out a simple yet elegant ring. "Elizabeth, you've shown me that love isn't about appearances or wealth. It's about kindness, about standing by someone's side no matter what. Will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. "Yes, James. 1,000 times, yes." Their wedding was intimate, attended only by close friends, family, and the children who had been touched by the foundation's work. In the front row, a seat was left empty, a single white rose placed on in memory of Mrs. Carter. James knew that if she had been there, she would have been smiling, proud of the man he had become. With Elizabeth by his side and the foundation thriving, James finally felt at peace. He had learned a valuable lesson. True wealth wasn't measured in money or status, but in the lives he touched and the love he gave. And as he held Elizabeth's hand, surrounded by laughter and joy, he knew that Mrs. Carter's spirit would always be with him, guiding him toward a life filled with love, kindness, and purpose. As James and Elizabeth settled into their new life together, they remained deeply involved in the Eleanor Carter Foundation. Their shared vision continued to grow, expand and provide not only education and shelter, but also emotional support for children who had lost their families. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace in their home, Elizabeth turned to James with a thoughtful expression. "There's something I've been wanting to talk to you about," she said softly. James set down his book and looked at her with concern. "What is it?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "I think we should consider adopting a child." For a moment, James was silent, his heart swelling with emotions he hadn't expected. He thought of his childhood, the loneliness, the longing for a real family, and then of Mrs. Carter, who had given him love when no one else had. A smile slowly spread across his face. "I think that's a wonderful idea." They began visiting orphanages supported by their foundation, meeting children who had endured hardships but still held on to hope. Then one day, they met Liam, a quiet 7-year-old boy with big brown eyes and a hesitant smile. Liam had been abandoned as a baby and had spent years moving between foster homes. When James sat beside him, he noticed the boy clutching an old, tattered stuffed bear. "That's a brave little bear you've got there," James said gently. Liam looked up, surprised. "He keeps me safe," he murmured. James felt his chest tighten. He knew that feeling all too well, the need to hold on to something when the world fell uncertain. He exchanged a glance with Elizabeth, who nodded, her eyes filled with warmth. A few months later, after all the paperwork was finalized, Liam officially became Liam Kensington. The day they brought him home, James knelt down and said, "This is your home now, Liam. You will never be alone again." The boy hesitated, then slowly wrapped his arms around James's neck. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered. The word Dad struck James like a bolt of lightning. Powerful, overwhelming, and beautiful. For the first time in his life, he understood the full circle of love. Mrs. Carter had cared for him, guided him, and now he had the chance to do the same for Liam. Years passed, and the Kensington family flourished. Liam grew into a kind, intelligent young man, inspired by his parents' dedication to helping others. On the day of his high school graduation, he stood before the crowd to give a speech. "My parents taught me that family isn't just about blood, it's about love," he said, looking directly at James and Elizabeth. "They gave me a second chance at life, and I hope to spend mine giving others the same opportunity." James felt tears pricking his eyes as he listened, his heart bursting with pride. As the applause filled the room, he glanced up at the sky, whispering, "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. Because of you, I know what it means to love and to be loved." And somewhere in the unseen corners of the universe, James knew that Mrs. Carter was smiling, her heart just as full as his. As time went on, the Kensington family continued to grow, not just in love but in purpose. James and Elizabeth expanded the Eleanor Carter Foundation, opening new centers across the country to support children from troubled backgrounds. Liam, now a university student, actively participated in the foundation's work, mentoring younger kids who had experienced hardships like he once had. One evening, as James sat in his study reviewing plans for a new children's shelter, Liam walked in, looking nervous yet determined. "Dad, there's something I want to tell you," Liam said, shifting on his feet. James set down his papers and gestured for him to sit. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" Liam took a deep breath. "I want to start my own initiative within the foundation, something focused on teenagers who age out of the foster system. A lot of them don't have anywhere to go, and I know what that feels like." James felt a wave of pride wash over him. His son had grown into a compassionate, driven young man, someone who didn't just want to succeed for himself, but wanted to lift others up along the way. "That's an incredible idea," James said, placing a hand on Liam's shoulder. "We'll make it happen together." Liam's initiative, Project Second Chance, became a major success. It provided housing, job training, and emotional support for young adults leaving the foster system, ensuring they had a path to stability and success. His work attracted national attention, and soon invitations for interviews and speaking engagements poured in. One such invitation came from an unexpected source: Victoria Kensington, James's ex-wife, now a well-known socialite and businesswoman. She had rebranded herself as a philanthropist and reached out, requesting a meeting with James and Liam. James hesitated. He hadn't spoken to Victoria since their divorce, and he wasn't sure if she had truly changed or if this was another attempt to align herself with something meaningful for the sake of appearances. But Liam, ever the optimist, encouraged a meeting. "Maybe she really wants to help," he reasoned. "If we can get more support for the kids, isn't it worth it?" Reluctantly, James agreed. The three of them met at an upscale restaurant in the city, and as soon as Victoria walked in, it was clear she was still as poised and elegant as ever. But there was something different in her eyes, something that resembled humility. "I'll get straight to the point," Victoria said, after exchanging pleasantries. "I was wrong, James, about a lot of things. I was blinded by wealth and status, and I didn't see what truly mattered. I've been following your work, and I want to contribute to Project Second Chance." James studied her carefully. "Why now?" Victoria sighed. "Because I've learned that money alone doesn't fill the emptiness inside. I see what you built, the lives you've changed, and I want to be part of something real." Liam, ever diplomatic, spoke up. "If you're serious about helping, we could always use more resources. But this isn't just about writing a check. It's about showing up." Victoria nodded. "I'm ready to show up." Over the next few months, Victoria proved she was committed. She funded housing programs, attended mentorship sessions, and even personally mentored young women in the program. While the wounds of the past couldn't be erased overnight, James saw that she was making a genuine effort. One evening, after a long day of work, James found himself standing at Mrs. Carter's memorial garden, a peaceful space he had built in her honor. He felt the cool evening breeze and closed his eyes. "You were right," he murmured, as if speaking to her spirit. "Love and kindness always win." In that moment, James felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for his journey, but for the people who had shaped it. Mrs. Carter, Elizabeth, Liam, even Victoria, in her own way. As he walked back toward his home, where his wife and son waited for him, he knew that his life's purpose had never been about wealth or power. It had always been about love, about giving, about making the world just a little bit better than he had found it. And he had no doubt that Mrs. Carter, wherever she was still smiling down on him. Years passed, and the Eleanor Carter Foundation continued to flourish. Under James, Elizabeth, and Liam's leadership, the foundation expanded its reach, helping thousands of children and young adults find stability, education, and a sense of belonging. One summer evening, James sat on the porch of his mansion, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Liam, now in his late 20s, joined him with a cup of tea in hand. "Big day tomorrow," Liam said with a smile. James chuckled. "Don't remind me. I'm getting too old for these grand events." Liam rolled his eyes playfully. "Dad, the Foundation's anniversary gala is important. We're celebrating 25 years of changing lives. You should be proud." James nodded, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "I am, son, more than you know." The next evening, the 25th anniversary gala of the Eleanor Carter Foundation was held in a grand ballroom. Leaders in philanthropy, business moguls, and beneficiaries of the foundation gathered to celebrate the legacy of love and kindness that James had built. As James walked through the crowd, he saw familiar faces. Children he had once helped, now grown into successful adults, giving back to their communities. He even spotted Victoria, standing beside a group of young women she had mentored over the years. She gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of respect. When it was time for James to take the stage, the entire room erupted into applause. As he stood before them, he took a deep breath, his heart swelling with emotion. "I never set out to change the world," he began. "I was just a boy who was lucky enough to have someone believe in him. Mrs. Eleanor Carter wasn't just my nanny, she was my guiding light. She taught me that love, kindness, and integrity are the greatest gifts one can give." He paused, glancing at Liam and Elizabeth, his pillars of strength. "This foundation was built on her values, and I see those values in my wife, in my son, and in every one of you who continues his mission. We have helped thousands, but our work isn't done, because for every life we change, there's another waiting for hope." Tears glistened in the eyes of many as James concluded. "Mrs. Carter may no longer be here, but her love still echoes in everything we do. And as long as I breathe, I will continue to honor her legacy." The audience gave him a standing ovation, and James felt something warm in his heart, something almost spiritual. As he stepped off the stage, Liam approached him with a knowing smile. "You've built something incredible, Dad." James looked at him proudly. "We built it together, son." And in that moment, James knew that the foundation's future was in safe hands. His journey, which had started as a lonely boy longing for love, had led him here, to a life filled with purpose, family, and the everlasting legacy of a woman who had given him everything. As he looked up toward the heavens, he whispered, "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. We did it." As the gala continued, James found himself stepping away from the crowd for a moment of quiet reflection. He walked to the balcony overlooking the city skyline, letting the cool night air wash over him. Memories of his past drifted through his mind, his childhood, the struggles he had faced, and the unwavering kindness of Mrs. Carter. He thought about the young boy he had once been, desperate for love and guidance. If only that boy could see him now. A gentle hand rested on his shoulder. It was Elizabeth. "Lost in thought again?" she asked with a soft smile. James exhaled, chuckling, "Just thinking about how far we've come." Elizabeth looked out at the city lights. Mrs. Carter would be so proud of you, James. Of everything you've done. James nodded. I hope so. She would be. A familiar voice said behind them. They turned to see Liam, standing there with a confident smile. He held a small, wrapped box in his hands. I have something for you, Dad. James raised an eyebrow. What's this? Liam handed him the box. Open it. James carefully unwrapped the package and found a beautifully framed photograph inside. It was an old picture of Mrs. Carter holding young James in her arms, both of them smiling. Below it, an engraved plaque read, A mother's love is not bound by blood, but by the heart. James felt his throat tighten as he traced his fingers over the image. Emotion swelled within him. Gratitude, love, and an overwhelming sense of peace. James cleared his throat, blinking away the moisture in his eyes. This is the greatest gift I've ever received. Liam smiled. I found the picture in some old storage boxes. I thought you should have it, so you always remember where this journey started. James pulled his son into a tight embrace. Thank you, Liam. This means more to me than you'll ever know. Elizabeth joined them, wrapping her arms around both of them in a warm family hug. At that moment, James realized something profound. Life had come full circle. The love he had received from Mrs. Carter had been passed down to his wife, to his son, and to the thousands of children whose lives had been touched by the foundation. His legacy wasn't his wealth, his status, or his business empire. It was the love he had shared, the kindness he had spread, and the lives he had changed. As he stood there, holding the photograph close to his heart, James whispered one final time, Thank you, Mrs. Carter. You were my first family, and because of you, I have one of my own. And somewhere in a place beyond sight, James felt certain that Mrs. Carter was smiling down at him, her love eternal, her legacy everlasting. As the years continued to unfold, the Eleanor Carter Foundation grew even more impactful. Under the leadership of James, Elizabeth, and Liam, the foundation reached new heights, providing mentorship, education, housing, and opportunities to countless children who once had no hope. They became an unstoppable force for change in the world, drawing support from all corners of the globe. One afternoon, as James was going through his usual meetings, he received an unexpected call. It was from a government official, Mr. Kensington. The voice on the other end said, I'm calling to inform you that the President would like to honor you with the National Philanthropy Award for your outstanding contributions to children's welfare and education. We'd like you to attend a special ceremony next month. James sat back in his chair, stunned. He had never done this work for recognition or praise. It had always been about doing what was right, what was needed, but this was an honor he couldn't ignore. He called Elizabeth and Liam, and the news spread quickly throughout the family. They were all excited. But James couldn't help but think of Mrs. Carter, how she would have reacted to this recognition. The night of the ceremony, the grand hall was filled with dignitaries, celebrities, and philanthropists. James was humbled as he walked across the stage to accept the award, his heart heavy with gratitude. The crowd stood in applause, but all he could think of was the woman who had shaped his life. As he took the podium, the spotlight shining on him, he smiled at the audience. This award isn't mine alone, he began, his voice steady. It belongs to everyone who has ever believed in the power of kindness. To my wife, Elizabeth, who has been my partner in every way. To my son, Liam, who has taught me so much about love and resilience. And most importantly, to the woman who gave me the love I never knew I needed, Mrs. Eleanor Carter. There was a pause, as the room fell silent in reflection. Without her, I wouldn't be standing here today. She taught me that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in the impact we have on the lives of others. James felt his eyes well up with tears, but he held them back. This foundation is not just a legacy of mine, it's hers. Her love and guidance live on in every child we've helped. And for that, I am eternally grateful. As he stepped down from the stage, Liam and Elizabeth were waiting for him. They embraced him tightly, their pride evident in their smiles. You did it, Dad, Liam said, his voice filled with admiration. You've built something incredible. I didn't do it alone, James replied softly. We all did. Together. The next day, after the ceremony had ended, the family gathered at the mansion. James took a moment to reflect on the years that had passed. From a boy who had been abandoned to a man who had changed the lives of countless others. He had come a long way, and in many ways, he felt that Mrs. Carter's spirit had been guiding him every step of the way. As they sat around the dinner table, Liam stood up, raising his glass. "To Dad," he began, his voice full of affection, "for teaching us all what it truly means to love, to give, and to never stop believing in the power of kindness." The family raised their glasses in agreement. To Dad. And in that moment, James felt a deep, quiet peace within himself. He had built a family, a legacy, and a future rooted in love. He had given back more than he had ever received. As the evening wore on, James stepped outside to the garden, the same garden he had created in Mrs. Carter's memory. He sat on the bench and looked up at the stars, a soft breeze rustling the leaves around him. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter," he whispered into the night, "for everything. I hope I made you proud." And somewhere in the quiet embrace of the universe, James knew that Mrs. Carter was watching over him, her heart full of pride and love, just as his was, as he continued the work she had started. As the years continued to pass, the Eleanor Carter Foundation became a beacon of hope, not just for children in need, but for people around the world who believe in the power of compassion and change. With James, Elizabeth, and Liam at the helm, the foundation expanded its scope, offering programs for young adults transitioning out of foster care, mental health support for those in need, and even leadership workshops for youth looking to make a difference in their own communities. James found that with each passing year, his connection to the mission grew stronger. What had started as a desire to honor Mrs. Carter had blossomed into a lifelong commitment, one that he shared not only with his family, but with an entire generation of children who were now growing up with the tools they needed to succeed. One winter morning, years after the gala where James had received the National Philanthropy Award, he received a call that would once again change the course of his life. The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, Victoria Kensington. She had been a part of their lives for many years now, no longer the woman she once was, but someone who had truly transformed through her involvement in the foundation. "James, there's something I need to share," Victoria said, her voice hesitant but filled with conviction. "I've been working on something that could change the lives of millions of children. It's a collaboration between several organizations, including ours, but it's going to need your leadership to make it work. It's something I think Eleanor would have wanted." James leaned forward in his chair, intrigued. "Tell me more." Over the next few months, Victoria, James, Elizabeth, and Liam worked tirelessly with other philanthropists, nonprofits, and even government organizations to create a groundbreaking global initiative called Project Hope. It aimed to tackle the root causes of poverty, provide sustainable education to underserved communities, and ensure that children around the world would have access to health care, nutrition, and emotional support. It wasn't just about feeding a child for a day or providing a temporary shelter. It was about creating lasting change and lifting families out of poverty. With James's leadership and the powerful network of individuals and organizations involved, Project Hope quickly garnered support from influential leaders, celebrities, and major international organizations. It became an unprecedented success, touching millions of lives across continents. One night, at a celebration marking the first year of Project Hope's success, James stood before a crowd of people who had contributed to the initiative. His heart swelled with pride as he saw the impact they had made together. But as he looked out over the sea of faces, his mind drifted back to the one person who had inspired this all, the woman who believed in him when no one else did. "Today," he said, as he raised his glass, "we celebrate the lives we've touched and the future we've built together. But we also honor the memory of one woman who made all of this possible, Mrs. Eleanor Carter. She showed me the true meaning of love, of giving, of building something that lasts. Without her, none of this would have been possible." The room fell silent for a moment, and then in unison, they all raised their glasses, a tribute to the woman whose spirit continued to live on in every act of kindness and every life that had been changed. James looked down at the photo of Mrs. Carter that he always carried in his wallet, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It had been years, but he could still feel her presence guiding him. He knew that everything he had done in his life, everything he had built, was in her honor. Later that evening, as James sat at his study with Elizabeth and Liam, the family reflected on the incredible journey they had shared. Liam, now in his early 30s, had become an influential figure in the world of social work and philanthropy, following his father's footsteps, but always bringing his own unique approach. "You've truly built something incredible, Dad," Liam said, his voice full of admiration. James smiled, his heart full of gratitude. "We built it together, son, every one of us." Elizabeth, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand. "We've changed the world, James. And I know that Mrs. Carter would be so proud of everything we've done. But more than anything, she would be proud of the family we've become." James felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He had accomplished far more than he had ever imagined, but what mattered most was the family he had created, the love they shared, the legacy they were building, and the difference they were making in the world. As they all gathered together for one final toast that evening, James couldn't help but feel a sense of calm and fulfillment. They had honored Mrs. Carter's legacy, and in doing so, had created a legacy of their own, one that would continue to touch lives for generations to come. He looked up at the night sky through the window of his study, a gentle smile crossing his face. "Thank you, Eleanor. I hope we made you proud." And somewhere, deep in his heart, he felt that she was still with him, guiding him as she always had.